Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming to today's conversation. We're going to be talking about the Food Assistance Education and Training Program. My name is Precious Miller. I'm the Director of Basic Needs and Belonging with Michigan Community College Association. And I am going to turn it over to our facilitator today to give us, to orient us to what we're going to be talking about today. Just as a quick note, we are going to be recording today's session. It's going to be emailed out to every person who has registered. Please feel free to share that far and wide. We're also going to share out some key resources that Kathy has curated, and I'll make sure those are also sent out alongside the webinar recording. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Kathy.
Hey, everybody. My name's Kathy Metcalf, and I am an E&T consultant with Seattle Jobs Initiative, and have worked on a grant that Precious has been part of with the Association for Public Human Services. I didn't say that right. Anyway, this is towards the end of the grant, and so I will be doing kind of a brief overview of SNAP employment and training with a little Michigan context, and then focusing on community college funding. To give you a little bit of background about me, I ran an E&T program at a community college in Washington, and then I worked for the State Board of Community and Technical Colleges in Washington, where I ran the BFET program, which is a basic food employment and training program in Washington for the 34 community and technical colleges in Washington. So we had the contract for all 34 community and technical colleges, and I did the technical assistance for those 34 community colleges, managed their budgets, or the budgets ran through me, did all the TA monitoring, etc., for the 34 colleges in Washington, who brought in, depending on the year, anywhere from $13 to $20 million in reimbursements for their colleges. So I do have some college experience with SNAP E&T, and am happy to answer any questions as we go through this. You can either come off mute and ask your questions, or throw them in the chat, and I'll try and keep my eye on that, or Precious will let me know if there's something there that I miss. I'm going to start with a brief overview of SNAP E&T for people who maybe missed the last workshop that I did. All states are required to operate SNAP employment and training programs. They have to submit an annual SNAP E&T plan to the Food and Nutrition Service, who runs the SNAP employment and training plan, which is through the U.S. Department of Agriculture. This program is funded through the Farm Bill. The legislative running oversight body is USDA. There's about $550 million annually that goes to states to operate the SNAP employment and training programs. In 2018, which is the last official data, SNAP E&T served just under 458,000 participants. And in 2020, there were just under 300,000 participants due to the pandemic. States have considerable flexibility in designing their programs. So that's why I said, you'll get some overarching information about SNAP E&T, but Michigan has gets to set its own rules and regulations around the program based on the requirements set by the Food and Nutrition Service. So why SNAP E&T for colleges? For students, SNAP E&T can support basic needs while they're in college. It can aid with items such as books, tools, clothing, internet, childcare, even tuition, and many more support services that oftentimes our community college students need in order to be able to complete their programs. It can provide case management for students struggling to navigate college systems. Oftentimes our students, especially our most at need students, are first generation or haven't had the supportive services or family support to understand the college system and need those extra supports, which E&T can help fund. For the college, reimbursements up to 50%, if you're a tribal college, up to 75% of non-federal funds already being spent on students and staff to serve the students can qualify for a reimbursement. And it is a reimbursement. And this is something you need to get clear in your head. It's not a grant. It's not getting money up front. You have to spend the money first, and then you submit to get a reimbursement. So the example that I use is it's like going to Costco and buying a bunch of diapers and sending in your receipt that says you bought $100 worth of diapers and the diaper company sends you $50 back. Okay, a rebate kind of thing. It's a reimbursement for money already spent. And then you can spend that money again on diapers and get reimbursed again if they have another rebate, which is exactly how this system works. So if you spend $100 and you get reimbursed $50, you can spend that $50 again and get reimbursed another $25. You can spend that $25 again and get reimbursed another $12.50. So it's a constant circle that continues. For that $100, you can keep investing it into the program and get the reimbursement funds. In Michigan, the Michigan Works programs take a 10% cut because they are the intermediaries. So the community colleges actually get a 45%, or excuse me, a 40% reimbursement, or if you're a tribal college, a 65% reimbursement. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we move forward. So what is a third-party provider? A third-party provider is an organization that contracts with the SNAP agency or the state's intermediary to provide employment and training services. So in Michigan, this means that you contract with your Michigan Works agencies. Students who receive FAP, your Food Assistance Program benefits through Michigan Department of Health and Human Services, qualify for E&T through the MWAs. So when you're thinking about doing this kind of a program, you actually contract with your local MWA that serves the bulk of your students. So if your students come from different Michigan Works agencies, you would have to contract with more than one Michigan Works agency to serve all of your students. Okay, so that's one thing to consider when you're thinking about this. If your college has different Michigan Works agencies that serve your students, you would have to contract with more than one Michigan Works agency. We would recommend that you start with the one that serves most of your students first, get all the processes in place, and then add another MWA in the process. So what do third-party providers have to do? They have to provide three things. They have to provide a program component, and the components are listed there. Supervised job search, job training skills, basic education like ESL or high school credentialing, work experience, vocational training, and job retention. You only have to provide one of those. So if you look at that list, you're all, as a community college, you provide vocational training, and most of you probably provide basic education as well. So you're already providing something you have to provide. You provide education, okay? You have to provide some supportive services. Common examples: transportation, tuition, books, supplies, tools. These are things that you have to be able to provide or offer referrals for the students to get these services somewhere else. But most of you are probably providing some of these things already through your college. So you're already doing that. The third thing is case management. And that can include something like an employability assessment, goal setting, planning. Okay, well, you're already doing those things as well. Most people outside of community colleges don't understand how much case management, hand-holding, and other things you do in community colleges. But those of us that work in community colleges know how much case management we do. Maybe we don't call it that, so to speak, but between what the faculty does, what advisors do, what even the administrative assistants do within the programs to keep students on track, to make sure they're getting the resources and those kind of things, that's all considered case management. So those are the three things that are required to be a third-party provider. And if you think about it, you're already doing all of these things, which is why it's a good fit for community colleges to become E&T providers. When you're thinking about the things to consider when becoming an E&T provider, these are the things that I need to turn off I apologize. Things that are important to look at when setting up an E&T program. The state always has priorities that they're looking at for new providers. And then you need to make sure you have enough participants that are receiving SNAP or can be eligible for SNAP. You need to make sure you have enough non-federal funds. You need to make sure you're providing those 3 services we just talked about. And you need to look at your capacity to provide the services. So these are the 4 things that you need to look at. And if you have all of these things, then when they overlap, that's your best opportunity for reimbursement. Any questions about this before, or general questions? This is just a brief overview of the SNAP E&T program.
There aren't any questions in the chat, but as they come through, I'll be sure to signal you.
Don't hesitate to throw them in if you have questions. So the main focus of today is funding, and talking about funding your program, how to determine what things are eligible for E&T reimbursement and that kind of thing. So I want to just review how SNAP E&T funding works. So the funding does come from the federal government, and there are 3 pots of money that come to states for SNAP E&T. There's what we call the 100% funds, there's pledged state funds, and then there's the 50-50 funds. So the 100% funds are based on a formula. They go to all states, and they're basically used to run the program. So the Department of Social and Health Services uses that money to pay their staff to run the program. They can use this money to help start up some programs if they have extra money. So it can be used to help the MWAs get started if they don't have a program. They can use it maybe to support third-party providers get started, but that's, that's the state's decision. The amount of money that comes to the state is based on a formula looking at the number of required E&T participants. And that's based on the number of ABODs that are in the state. ABODs are able-bodied adults without dependents, which is a subset of your SNAP recipients that are required to do some kind of training or must be working in order to receive their SNAP benefits. And so based on the number of ABODs that are in your state, controls the amount of 100% money, 100% funds that comes to your state. Okay. So then there's this pledge state money, which is an amount of money that if you pledge to serve ABODs in a particular way with a particular project, your state can get some additional money to serve ABODs. Right now, there's only one state that's receiving pledge money, and it's South Dakota. There's a lot of attachments to that money, so most states don't apply for it. The third set of funds is what we're talking about today, and these are the 50-50 funds or the reimbursement funds. This is actually an unlimited amount of money at this point. And so every state can ask for as much money as they want each year. So it's based on the amount of money that the third-party providers project that they would be asking for reimbursement over the course of the year. This money is adjusted every year. The state asks for X amount of money for 1 year, and the next year, if they need more, they can ask for more. If over the course of the year, it turns out that their third-party providers are doing much better than they thought and are asking for more reimbursement than they thought they would need to, the state can ask for more money over the course of the year if necessary. So it is pretty much an open-ended amount. There are some requirements for requesting more money, but you are making a projected budget when you request funds from the state for this thing. So you can adjust your budget. Those 50/50 funds can be used for administrative reimbursement and participant reimbursements for supportive services. Those 50/50 funds are extremely flexible. Okay. Every state sets up what they'll allow for this, and you can always ask if something that you think a student needs to complete their program and it's not on the list, you can always ask for that to be reimbursed. It is extremely flexible.
Kathy, is there a financial, I don't want to use the word punishment, but nothing else is coming to mind. Are colleges, what's the negative consequence for changing your budget in the middle of the year?
There is none. In fact, oftentimes, like we in Washington, we would do what we call a funding survey every quarter to see if some colleges weren't spending and some colleges needed more money, and we'd move money around because you're making a projection. You have no idea. I mean, you're hoping this many students are going to be involved, but it's a projection. And you have to spend the money up front before you can get the reimbursement. So if your students aren't there, then you've essentially reserved X amount of dollars. And there might be a college who got a lot more students than they were expecting and you didn't. You could essentially release your hold on that money and another college could use it. Well, next year, the opposite may happen. You underprojected and another college overprojected, and they might share their money with you. Or if something happened and the state had a huge layoff or, a natural disaster, and you ended up with a lot more people needing training, the state could ask for additional funds for all the colleges. It is not a set in stone kind of thing at all. And the thing about it is that the money is not attached to any outcomes. I know that sounds terrible, but the 50/50 money is not attached to any outcomes because it's attached to the students being on SNAP. So that's the key. And so if a student is removed from SNAP, then they no longer qualify for you to get reimbursement from them. That's the only caveat. So you might say you're going to serve 10 students, you only serve 5. That's okay, but the state might say next year, don't project that you're going to serve 50 if last year you only served 5. So they'll look at what your projection is for the following year. That would be the only caveat.
Sure. There was another question that came through in the chat. It reads, how does a community college validate administrative reimbursement? What types of dedicated activities might apply?
That's coming.
Cliffhanger, Kathy.
Cliffhanger. I know, it's coming. Okay. So we just kind of went over this, the 100% grant funds, 50/50 reimbursement. So we have the 100% grant funds. This is formula based. In 2022, that was 104 million. All states receive funds. The 50/50 reimbursement funds are for the third party provider. The reimbursement funds for SNAP FAE&T program costs include staff, planning and operations, program services are case management, supportive services, the participant reimbursements such as childcare and transportation, and funds eligible for reimbursement need to be non-federal. Okay, that's the critical piece. Because if you're reimbursing federal funds, you're essentially double dipping. So you need to use non-federal funds to get reimbursement. So again, this is how the cycle works. The college provides E&T services to its participants, fronting the associated costs. It is not a grant. The SNAP agencies review your reports of SNAP participant and expense data to confirm the total amount that is eligible for reimbursement. Then the college receives up to 50%, and in your case, it's 40%, for allowable expenses. The reimbursed funds come back to you unrestricted. You want to think about it this way. You're putting the money up. You're getting reimbursed for that money you already put up. So it's not federal money that comes back to you. It's your money that's coming back to you. So the money comes back to you can be spent any way that you see fit. If you spend it again on the SNAP E&T program, it will be reimbursed again. But you can spend it on anything. So if you have a student who's not on SNAP E&T, but desperately needs help, you could spend this money on those students as well. It just won't be reimbursed again. But any money that you get reimbursed on and then spend again on the SNAP E&T program will get reimbursed a second, third, fourth, fifth time. So if you reinvest the reimbursement within the SNAP E&T program, it will get reimbursed a second time. It's a cycle. So, funding. Funds must be non-federal and not leveraged to another federal grant program. So common examples of non-federal funds. State funds that support your staff or your instructors. Sometimes states have dropout funds that serve students who have dropped out of high school. States sometimes provide worker retraining funds in areas, that have high demand jobs. They might have targeted funds, state funds, not federal funds, that are given to community colleges to train, retrain workers for particular jobs. There might be state workforce funding. Your state might have state needs grants for low-income students that are separate from Pell Grants. Those are non-federal funding that can be used for reimbursements. Some states have foster care youth funds to help support foster care youth going to college. Those would be reimbursed funds, reimbursable funds. These are just a few funds. These are just examples. You probably have other funds in Michigan that could work. Any foundation grants could be used, any donations from businesses, any local grants, county and city funds. These are just examples of the kind of funds that could be used to fund your SNAP E&T program. So when you're assessing your potential for reimbursement, it has to be non-federal and not federally matched. It has to be tied to a SNAP E&T activity, and it has to be applied to a participant that's SNAP E&T eligible. Okay, and a SNAP E&T eligible student is a student who's on SNAP and accepted into the SNAP E&T program through your MWA. And the requirements for being a SNAP E&T qualified student would mean that they're participating in a SNAP E&T program at the community college, and that they're SNAP eligible, and that they're willing to work upon completion of their program. And SNAP E&T qualified programs, the easiest way to think about them, if you're familiar, is most Perkins programs qualify. Okay, ABE, ESL qualifies. The idea is it's a program that leads to a job. So most vocational short-term certificates qualify. The pre-college stuff qualifies. Any I can't remember what Michigan calls IBEST, your integrated skills programs. If you have any training programs that work with ABE and vocational training integrated, those all qualify. Any 2-year degrees that lead to a job, directly to a job, they tend to not be like a liberal arts degree. Doesn't tend to qualify because even though we know as community college people that any college training leads to a better job, the E&T program is specifically focused on training that would lead directly to a specified job. So like welding leads to a welding job. It's hard to say exactly what job a liberal arts degree will lead to, as opposed to like a early childhood education leads to an early childhood education job. A 2-year degree in accounting will lead to an accounting job. Medical assisting, a nursing degree, farm tech, those are all the kind of things where you can say at the end of your program, they'll most likely be able to become employed. Transfer degrees don't usually work because the idea is, again, that the students are going directly into work after completing their certificate or degree. So thinking about the kind of things that qualify, if you're looking at staff time, if you have money that's spent on navigators or case managers or something that are working with SNAP E&T students that are enrolled in worker retraining programs, the time spent with SNAP E&T students would be reimbursable. Okay, as long as they're being funded by non-federal, as long as the staff is being funded by non-federal funds. If you have some dropout funds that are used to pay for ABE staff working with SNAP E&T students, those kind of their time would be reimbursable. State needs grants that are funding students who don't qualify for Pell or need support beyond Pell would be reimbursable. Students who have bachelor's degrees that are coming back or other degrees that are coming back for retraining because their degree in English isn't getting them a job anymore and they need more technical training. They've already used their Pell Grants, so now they don't have any other way to fund their training. E&T, if you have a non-federal source for their tuition, you can get reimbursed 50% back or 40% back for their tuition. Foster care funds is another way. Oftentimes states set up tuition sources for foster care youth. Those funds can be reimbursed at 40%, excuse me, for you. So those are just some examples of ways you can get reimbursement. Participant reimbursements, worker retraining dollars that are used to cover books, tools, and uniforms, those can be reimbursed. If you have foundation money to cover eyeglasses or housing help or testing fees, those can be reimbursed back to the college at 50%. If your college provides bus passes or other gas cards or something, those can be reimbursed at 50%, 40%, sorry. So one of the main things you want to do when you're thinking about funding is work with your finance department to determine what non-federal funds are already being used by potential students in your targeted area of focus. So once you figure out kind of what program you're targeting or where you're going to look to offer your E&T program, look at what funding sources are already being used for that particular program so that you can see what non-federal sources the students are already accessing. That way you know what our potential reimbursement level or what number of students might be qualifying, and you might be able to get reimbursement for them. Look at the staff that are supporting those students. Is staff being funded from non-federal funds already? Or is there a way to move some non-federal funds to a portion of the staff's funding? For instance, they don't have to be funded 100% by non-federal funding sources. If they're spending 20% of their time with E&T students, you need to find 20% non-federal funding sources for that position so that you can get reimbursed for that 20% of the time that they're spending with E&T students. Talk to your foundation about setting up a fund for your program supportive services. We worked with the college in Minnesota last year that we were on a TA call. The program director called his foundation and said, we need a fund to help to start supportive services. For every dollar you put in, we get 50 cents more from the state. And the foundation committed $3,000 for the first quarter right away. So they had a fund to start for supportive services because the foundation director knew with an ROI of 1.5, he could sell the program to a funder. So there's lots of different ways to look at this. I had another college who sat down with their business office, and the business person said, well, we've got this $60,000 from PepsiCo that no one's using. It comes in every year. I don't know what to do with it. And so she handed over the $60,000 to the SNAP E&T program to get them started. Oftentimes the business office knows where that there's all this non-federal funding, but it just kind of goes in random places where you could give them a targeted place to use it that would bring reimbursement back to the college. So knowing who knows this kind of information and where to go to ask for it is key to the success of your program. So when you're thinking about building a budget for SNAP E&T, it's really important to understand, what funds would be supporting this program already. What of those funds are non-federal? Getting a handle on personnel-related E&T services for the program. What program services are tied to your E&T components? Separate out any disallowable costs. And then make sure you include indirect costs. You can get reimbursed for your indirect costs. Most colleges have a NICRA amount that is allowable for reimbursement. So if you don't, you can always use a 10% de minimis. But if you have a 20, 30, 40% NICRA value, you can get reimbursed for that NICRA amount as well through the SNAP E&T program. And that can bring in another large chunk of change to help support your SNAP E&T program. And make sure you can make a decent estimate of the students that will be eligible for SNAP. Okay. So when you're trying to project your budget, you need to have a pretty good idea of how many students you think will be SNAP E&T eligible. And in order to do that, you need to have a pretty good idea of how many of your students on your campus are eligible for SNAP. So here are some examples of budget categories that you can use to get reimbursement. So salaries and fringe benefits are allowable costs. Travel for training for staff that are working with SNAP E&T activities. Goods and services, examples, if ABE or your ABE and ESL program is one of the programs you're targeting, if they use TABE or CASAS testing, you can get reimbursed for the cost of the testing based on the percentage of E&T students within the program. So if 10% of the ABE students are E&T students, then you could get reimbursed for 10% of your testing costs, 10% of your book costs. Because most of this, it's free tuition usually for ABE and ESL students. So you can't get reimbursed, obviously, for free tuition, but you could get reimbursed for your book costs and your testing costs and things like that through the E&T program. If you need supplies for your farm tech program, there's that you buy as a whole for the program. If 10% or 20% of your farm tech program qualifies for SNAP E&T, 20% of those supply costs could be reimbursed through SNAP E&T. Those are things that you can think about when you're looking at reimbursements. Now, if only 5% of the program is E&T, it may not be worth, the trouble. But if you have really expensive program costs, you can look at getting reimbursed for some of those goods and services. We talked about the indirect costs. Tuition can be reimbursed if you have a non-federal source. Things to think about when it comes to tuition, you can't supplant. And so most of our SNAP E&T students will qualify for Pell, but Pell can be used for things that SNAP E&T can't. So like Pell can be used for living expenses, SNAP E&T can't. So if you have a student that needs living expenses, you can post things, you can post E&T for books and supplies before you post Pell, so that the Pell money can be used for living expenses. You're not supplanting then, because you're still providing all the things that the student needs in order to meet their need to go to college, kind of thing. So you can work on with your financial aid office on how things are, the order that things are granted in order to maximize the support for your students. Here are just some examples of participant reimbursements. Testing fees. You can, E&T can cover background checks. It can cover testing fees for CNAs, the nursing fees, GED testing, or HiSET testing, depending on, I don't know what test Michigan uses. It can cover any kind of like farm tech testing, whatever upfront testing, CPR testing, any of those kind of things that cost extra for the students. E&T can help cover those costs. If someone needs glasses and you have a non-federal funding source to cover, yep, fingerprinting is covered. Yep, thank you, Precious. If a student is having trouble, can't afford internet, E&T can help cover the cost of internet. If E&T can also purchase computers for students, if you have a non-federal funding source to buy those computers. Thanks, Patrick. So E&T can cover the reimbursement costs for both the GED and HiSET. So there's a lot of supports that E&T can cover if you have a non-federal funding source that covers those costs. You can get reimbursed up to the 40% for those costs, and that money comes right back to you to help support more students within your college. So
We
when
have
you're
a
looking,
hand raised.
oh, okay.
Hey, Kathy. We have an emergency assistance program, and it occurs to me if we're part of the SNAP E&T program, it probably makes sense to. I guess you're going to, if you've not already gotten to it and I missed it, how we identify these SNAP eligible students. But I'm assuming it would be good to probably put a question on each one of those forms saying, "Are you on SNAP?" And then we would automatically just count all those funds that we funnel to them through our emergency program as eligible for the program.
So they have to be on SNAP and then they have to be approved for a SNAP E&T program.
Okay.
So once you become a third-party provider, then the students who are in SNAP eligible programs, you would run their eligibility through the MWA, through your Michigan Works Agency to get them approved for the SNAP E&T program. And then you can get reimbursement for those activities.
So they would already have to be part of the program through MWA and approved as part of our kind of like a Pell, or not a Pell, a Perkins student, where they're designated and in a queue are already designated as part of this program.
Right, for the month that they receive services. So if they apply for an emergency grant in June, but they don't actually get the money till July, you would have a month to get them registered.
Got it. Thank you.
So, one of the things, and this Precious can get me back again anytime we can talk about more about this. But you want to set up a system where you're catching people at the beginning, once you become a third-party provider, where you're either catching people who are on SNAP and get them registered in a SNAP E&T, get them eligible for SNAP E&T as soon as possible. Or if they're coming through the emergency grant program, ask them on their application if they're on SNAP and what program they're in, so that you can then get them registered. There's a couple of different ways to do that. Or if they're on the emergency grant application, you could ask them if they might be eligible for SNAP, and you can do what we call a reverse referral, where they can get eligible for SNAP and then become a SNAP E&T student if they're already in an eligible program. So there's a couple of different ways that you can attack this to maximize the number of students that can be in your E&T program.
And Josh, I'd be happy to schedule a brief touch point to talk more specifically about what would be the best approach to make sure you're targeting your pocket of students. That's not a problem at all.
Great. Thanks, Precious.
Okay. So you can't supplant financial aid. We talked about that. All staffing has to be time and effort tracked. If you plan to bill for reimbursement, and you need to reconcile that time and effort at least annually. So what that means is, if you on your budget say that 10% of your time is going to be spent managing the E&T program, then over the course of the year, you have to be able to show on time and effort that 10% of your time was actually spent on E&T. If it's more than that, then you can bill up to 5% more for your time, as long as you have enough non-federal funding sources paying for your salary, up to 5%. If it's less than that, you reconcile it and you either adjust on your last bill to the state to cover the difference, or you refund or do something to reconcile that amount. You can only bill for activities you're doing just for E&T students, not activities that are done for all students. That's one of the requirements. This is supposed to be an add-on support for the students. Example of something like that is you have a tutoring center. All students have access to the tutoring center. if you schedule particular time or have a particular tutor hired just for E&T students, that tutor could be paid for through E&T and reimbursed by E&T because it's something extra for the E&T students. An example at one of the colleges, or at a college that I worked at, we had a farm tech program, and dosage calculations were really difficult for students. And so we had a tutor specifically for E&T students in farm tech on dosage calculations. And once a week, the E&T tutor met with the E&T students in farm tech to work on dosage calculations. That tutor was reimbursable because they were providing services directly to the E&T students, and that was different than what was available to all other students. Additional case management that's provided to the E&T students is reimbursable. You kind of have to think about it from that regard. Key considerations. You probably don't want to list any positions as full-time FTEs because you have to cover those 100% with local funds, local non-federal funds, especially at the beginning. You probably won't have someone that's 100% spending time just on E&T. As your program builds, you might get to that point. Ineligible program expenses, you can't reimburse for participant meals, mental health. You can't cover both tuition and instructor costs because tuition is considered paying for instructors. So in your credit bearing classes, if you're covering tuition for someone, you're also covering the cost of the instructors. So you can't do that. That's considered double dipping. But in like ABE, for instance, since there is no tuition, if you're paying an instructor and 10% of their class is E&T students, you could get reimbursed for 10% of their salary for that particular class because tuition is free. Okay. So you have to kind of think about that when you're thinking about your program expenses. We talked about indirect. Costs must be reasonable and necessary and directly related to successful program participation and completion for your students. Budget versus actuals. This is tricky. Your budget is your best guess, but you will be funded, reimbursed based on your actual expenses incurred. And so you're making your best guess for the year. But your business office wants to set it up like a regular grant and put a whole budget in the system. They really shouldn't do that. You only need a revenue and an expense account in your budget for E&T because the funding sources are all other funding sources. So I want to go through a little exercise kind of to talk through how this might work. So you want to estimate the percentage of an employee's time that would be allocated to the SNAP E&T program. So you might have an accountant or a fiscal specialist who dedicates 10 hours a week to E&T. So that's 25% of their total working hours. So look down here in this chart, they're dedicating 25% of their time to E&T. They're actually funded 50% of their time out of the general funds. So that more than covers their 20% time spent to E&T. They actually have grant funding the other 50% of their time. Their total FTE is 1.0. So if they have to spend more time on FTE, there is some wiggle room here from the general funds. Another example is a case manager. They're spending 30% of their time working with E&T students. They're funded 30% out of general funds. So there's no wiggle room here. If they spend more time on SNAP E&T, you'll only be able to bill 30% because they're only funded 30% out of non-federal funds. Their other funds are federal and ineligible to be reimbursed. Yeah. So just going through this example, the case manager makes $75,000. Their benefits are 25% of their salary. So their total compensation is $93,750. 30% would be 28,125. So they're eligible for reimbursement on this amount. As long as the college can show upfront payment of 28,125 from non-federal funds, they'd be eligible for half of that. In your case, 40% of that, but half would be $14,000. So over the course of the year, you could bring in $14,000 of reimbursement for that particular position. Efforts, just to give you an idea of the kind of tracking you would have to do, you just need to track the hours that are spent on E&T. So how many hours the person is spending on their SNAP E&T students. I've left some guidance on SNAP E&T or on time and effort with Precious that she will share with you to kind of give you an idea. Most colleges are used to tracking time and effort. So it's not that big of a deal, but I did put some guidance together. I'm talking faster because we're running out of time. So one of the keys is braiding funding. Like I said before, you don't have to have your staff all non-federally funded. You just need to have the time that they're spending on SNAP E&T not federally funded. So you can have like that example with the case manager, they were funded partially non-federally and the other part of their time was funded federally. You just need to have the time they're spending with SNAP E&T students funded with non-federal funds. So WIOA can fund ABE training costs, but not supportive services. So E&T could fund the testing fees, childcare, transportation, but not some of the other funds. If WIOA is funding your navigator, your case management, then let them fund that, and then you fund other things with the E&T program. Staff can be funded from both WIOA and non-federal when working with E&T students, okay? Co-enrollment is critical. You can be enrolled in a program that's used to cover costs, such as WIOA or state training dollars, and also enrolled in your E&T program so that you can take advantage of all the different funding sources to support your students. If you have a program that's already covering tuition and fees, and then you can cover the supportive services or other services with other funding sources. It's a matter of kind of looking at all the different funding sources you have and what you can rearrange to maximize your reimbursement. As an example, CARE is a medical assistant program. The program is being paid by state training funds. Those training funds cover tuition, books, uniforms, and tools. The workforce program has a navigator that supports these students with case management that's paid for by WIOA funds and state funds. CARE's on SNAP. The case manager does a reverse referral to get CARE into the state E&T program. Once approved, the college can bill for reimbursement up to 50% of those tuition and fees because they were state funds. Books, tools, and uniforms, also state funds. If the case manager uses salary is paid with state funds, then you can get reimbursed for that. You can get reimbursed for any data entry time required by E&T and any invoicing time in your business office required by E&T. If additional supports are needed, local funds could be used for childcare or transportation and then billed for reimbursement as well. These slides will come out to you as well from Precious when we're done. So when looking at sources that fund student costs, you want to look for those 100% upfront costs that can be covered by non-federal funding first. And then look for programs that are covered mostly by non-federal and some federal. You know, you kind of go down your list to target. We always recommend that you target start small. So find that program that you can get everything set up in. Start small. It's easy to expand. You know, so go through and know which state and federal programs cover supportive services, what they support. Remember, E&T can't supplant. Federal funding can cover many expenses, but leave some critical pieces out. Those are the places that E&T can fill in the gaps. This is just an example of a college who put together kind of a chart for their navigators. They had a chart for credit and non-credit students. They listed all the non-federal funds that were available in their college, and then what the federal funds were, so that they could say, okay, this student, you know, could qualify for these things, but not these things. And so it was just an easy way to kind of go through the funding sources that were available at their college and what qualified for E&T and what didn't. Just a tool you might want to think about putting together. When you're thinking about your staff, remember you can pay staff from both federal and non-federal. Probably know this. Staff time spent on E&T students and activities is only reimbursable if non-federal funds paid for the staff time on these students and activities. Case manager funded by federal grant working with E&T students, none of their salary would be reimbursable if it's all funded by a federal grant. A case manager funded 50% by federal and 50% state funded could potentially get reimbursed for their salary if they spent up to 50% of their time on E&T students. You must have at least as much salary funded by non-federal as you are requesting reimbursement. This is a list of things that you'll be required to do as part of an E&T program: budget creation and monitoring, tracking time and effort, maintenance of receipts and records for your participant reimbursement, invoicing the state or the intermediary, in your case, the MWAS, for those funds spent, budget amendments, if you change your budget, if you need more money, that kind of thing. And there'll be a fiscal monitoring every once in a while for that. Or sometimes it's yearly, sometimes it's biannually. It just depends on how your MWA sets that up. Couple of things to remember. This is not a grant. Don't set up a full profile in your accounting system. Work with your business office to identify ways to maximize your reimbursement by rearranging funding sources for key positions. Work with your financial aid office about time of posting things to make sure you can maximize your E&T supports. Make sure all staff positions listed in the budget fill out your time and effort reports. And remember, the budget amendments can happen. If you need more money, don't forget to ask. And finally, just remember that SNAP E&T is meant to be a layover program. You're not supposed to hire new people to do this. It's if you build up enough money in your reimbursement funds, and you can save those funds for as long as you want, you don't have to respend them right away. You can save them to a point where you could potentially pay for a staff member, and that's great. But the idea is that you're already doing everything that's required for this program. So why not get the reimbursement money back for what you're already doing? Yes, you may have to add a couple of tasks to people, maybe a little more data entry. Maybe they have to ask a couple more questions when they're doing intake and assessment. Programs have started from just salary reimbursement. You get a monthly reimbursement. So if you start 1 month, you send in your invoicing, you get money back the next month. And that money could be used for supportive services for students as soon as you get the money back. Okay. So, you know, you can start with just staff salary reimbursements. You want to work with your MWA to find ways to provide what they need from what you already have. And I want to emphasize this. The MWAs don't necessarily know your database systems and what you have and how you can provide data that they're asking for. They may say, well, we need this and it has to be in this form. And you can say, well, our data programs produce X. Will this work? Can we give it to you in this form? Or, you know, what can we do to provide data that you need in a way that isn't difficult for us? So talk about your systems to see if they can communicate. Don't feel like, you know, they're dictating everything to you. It's a partnership. Find ways to work together to make this work for you so it isn't an extra burden. It's not meant to be an extra burden. It's meant to be a layover program. I like to think about it again, just a final example is think about an amoeba. It needs a place to hang on to begin with. So you find that beginning program that you're going to start, you get it all connected, you figure out all your processes, and then once that's done, it's very easy for the amoeba to ooze out over to all your other programs, and you can bring in lots more students into the E&T family along the way. But you've got to get that center point, or that point that's connected, to get everything set up to start. Okay, I talked really fast.
No, Kathy, thank you so much for the presentation. And it's like you and I are connected, because that was a great segue to resources that I wanted to share with the institutions on the call about ways to get started, specifically with grant opportunities that are available through the Office of MyLeap. I have placed a link in the chat for all of you to utilize. There's up to $400,000 that can be used, that colleges can apply for and use to scale their SNAP E&T program. It's called the Barrier Removal Grow College Capacity Grant, and colleges can apply in June, August, and November of this year. So I just wanted to make a quick plug for that. I'm also going to send the slides that Kathy shared today along with the link to that specific grant for colleges to begin to look at and apply for, and some additional resources that you can utilize as you continue to assess this program for your campus. And with that, I will end our time together today. Thank you for coming.
And if you have any questions, send them to Precious. And if Precious doesn't know the answer, she'll send them to me, and I'll be happy to answer any further questions.
Thank you, Kathy, for your partnership. I always appreciate it and value your feedback. Have a great day.